This video is for educational purposes only. Our group is allowing our instructor, Mr. Roldan Ardines, to use this as an educational material.
Hello everyone! Today we will be talking about the self from the perspective of the various philosophers in the Greek ancient, medieval philosophy, and postmodernism.
Who am I? Rock anthem, Who Are You?
Socrates believed that it is the duty of the philosopher to know oneself. To live without knowing who you are and what virtue you can attain is the worst thing that can happen to a person. Thus, he noted, unexamined life is not worth living. These give us a clear idea of what Socrates meant in knowledge by context. To know is to know oneself. Indeed, for us to attain the good life, we must examine ourselves. The reason for this is quite obvious. Virtue is intrinsic to the human person, which can be accessed through self-examination. Since virtue is intrinsic to the human person, Socrates was convinced that the human person can discover the truth, and that is the truth of the good life. Once the person discovers the truth, she then does what she thinks is the right thing to do. Thus, we have this line of Socrates: knowing what is right is doing what is right.
Imagine someone working on a job they hate simply because it pays well, without ever questioning whether it's truly fulfilling. By not examining their life, they miss an opportunity to pursue a career they're passionate about, leading to regret and dissatisfaction in the long run.
According to Aristotle, the soul is the essence of the self. He defined man as a rational animal, for we have a free will and intellect. Only man, in God's creation, has the ability to think. So therefore, we should use our decisions wisely, and this will definitely lead us to self-actualization. For example, your parents are working hard just to send you to school. So you better do your part as a child and as a student, and think wisely that it is for your own good when the right times comes. It is your choice whether you do what is right from evil, for you have the intellect that will allow you to make your own decisions. According to Plato, the self is an immortal soul. Everyone in this world has a purpose, for each one of us should do our part. It means that every one of us has a unique purpose in life, and it's important for each of us to contribute and fulfill it. Plato expounded on the idea of the soul by stating that it has three parts or components: the appetitive soul, the rational soul, and the spirited soul. The appetitive soul is the one responsible for the desires and cravings of a person. The rational soul is the thinking, reasoning, and judging aspect. And the spirited soul is accountable for our emotions. For instance, a person who dedicates their life to helping others, such as a doctor working in underserved communities, may embody this idea. By contributing the well-being of others, they are living out their higher purpose, believing their actions have lasting value beyond just their lifetime.
the self as an immortal soul. A self can't live in this world without a body, for it is to consider as a unity of God and self. So Saint Augustine views the self as a spiritual soul created in the image of God, with its true purpose being unity with God. In Confessions, he emphasizes introspection and memory as tools for self-knowledge, which ultimately leads knowing God. However, he sees the self as divided, corrupted by original sin, which inclines it towards selfishness and disordered desires. Only divine grace can restore harmony and align the self with its true ultimate purpose. He believed that much of human suffering arises from our attachment to the ego, or the false self that we created through identification with external things, roles, and labels. DeMello taught that we can find freedom and inner peace by detaching ourselves from labels and ego-driven desires.
Boy Pargoy Gak.
René Descartes, the self as thinking being. Descartes emphasized that the essence of the self is found in act of thinking and self-awareness. Is capitulated by his famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Dualism. He proposed that the mind, thinking substance, and the body, physical substance, are separate identities, with the mind being the true self, self-knowledge, and certainty. Descartes believed that the self is known with certainty, unlike the external world, which may be deceived. Independence from physical world. For him, the exist independently of material world as thinking cannot be doubted even if physical reality is uncertain. John Locke's perspective about self. Self as consciousness. Locke viewed the self defined by continuous consciousness, including thoughts and memories. Memory and personal identity. He argued that personal identity is rooted in continuity of memory. If you can remember past experience, you are the same person who lived them. Self and body. Locke rejected the nation and identity defends the persistence of consciousness, moral responsibility. Locke connected personal identity to moral accountability, claiming that if someone remembers an action, they morally responsible for it, regardless of physical or spiritual changes.
This is David Hume, own perspective about self. The self, according to Hume, is a bundle or collection of different reception. It is the self that is constructing and organizing principle of experience which creates a world that is familiar, predictable, and significantly be called as mine. Example:
I myself is the one who's discovering the world, for I am the driver of my life. Nobody will do it for me, for it transcends the experience in my mind as well as the sense of mind. This is Immanuel Kant's own perspective about self. We all have an inner and outer self, which together from our consciousness. Man is a bundle of all sensation and perception. When people will content of experience, what they can see are just impression and ideas that result to imagination. Example, our first impression towards our new classmate from other country is quiet, for he doesn't speak us. Well, we cannot totally define who is he if he will not talk or engage with us. For our imagination is moving that defines that personal identity a certain person.
Maurice Merleau-Ponty believed the physical body to be an important part of what makes up the subjective self. He believed that the self is deeply connected to the body. He argued that the body is not just something we have, but something we are. For him, the body is the foundation of how we experience the world and understand ourselves. Unlike traditional views that separate the mind and body, Merleau-Ponty saw them as inseparable. He introduced the idea of the living body, which means our body is not just a physical object, but a part of how we think, feel, and perceive. For example, when we interact with the world, our body and mind work together to create meaning. He also emphasized the perception of how we see and experience the world is active and shaped by our bodies. This view challenges the idea that the mind alone defines the self. Instead, the self emerges from the relationship between our body, mind, and environment. Merleau-Ponty's perspective reminds us that the self is not just a thinker or observer, but an embodied being, always shaped by physical and lived experiences.
One speak about the man as the experience totally of one's life. Edmund Husserl's perspective about self, what is a unity of the mental and physical experience directly through intuition. He believed that the self is complex, multidimensional, and dynamic entity that is rooted in nature and social interactions. His approach to understanding the self is based on the idea that all knowledge comes from experience. He also believed that the self embodied that the mental and physical are inseparable, and the self is social and shaped by the interaction with others. On the one hand, Husserl speaks about the self as the experience totally of one's life.
Paul Churchland. The physical brain is where we get our sense of self. Paul Churchland believed that the self is the brain, and that the mind is reducible to the physical brain. He believed that the brain is not separate from the body, and that idea of the mind is compatible with the theory of evolution. Paul Churchland. Rather than dualism, Churchland holds to materialism, the belief that nothing but matter exists. Churchland believes that our mental states and experience are not properly understood through the folk psychological concept of beliefs, desires, and intentions, which are part of the everyday framework human use to make sense of behavior. Instead, he suggests that As neuroscience advances, we will gradually abandon these concepts in favor of a more accurate neurobiological understanding of the brain and its functions. In this sense, Churchland's view on the self is closely connected to his broader eliminative materialism. He argues that the self we perceive is an ongoing, unified entity is likely a construct, a simplified and possibly misguided
This is Michael Foucault's own perspective about self. The self or subject is not a substance. It is a form. And this form is not primarily or always identical to itself. It means self is not a fixed entity. Foucault rejects the idea that the self is a solid, unchanging thing. Instead, it's dynamic and changing. Self is a shape or structure. Foucault uses the word form to describe the self. This means that the self is a shape or structure that's shaped by various forces. Self is not always the same. Foucault says that this form, the self, is not always identical to itself. This means that the self can change, adapt, and evolve over time. Example, imagine a person named Maria, who used to be shy and introverted. Over time, through experience and self-reflection, Maria becomes more confident and outgoing.
He argued that the self is shaped through language, cultural practices, and social interaction. For him, the self is more about creating useful, meaningful stories about ourselves that will help us navigate life. He believed that we should focus on the practical social aspect of selfhood rather than pursuing a deep abstract notion of personal identity. In Eastern philosophy, the self is generally viewed as an illusion, meaning that the idea a separate individual self does not exist in reality, and we are all interconnected with the universe. Unlike Western thought, which often says the self is a stable entity, Eastern philosophy argues that the self is constantly changing and is not a fixed, independent unit. The goal is to transcend the illusion of the individual self and realize a state of the unity with larger cosmos.
In conclusion, the concept of self-perspective varies widely across philosophers, with some focusing on individual identity and rational thought, while others emphasize social influences, personal growth, and existential freedom, offering a diverse understanding of the self.
둥글게 둥글게